St. Petersburg, Finnish. Pietari, Swedish. St. Petersburg is the second largest city in Russia. It is politically incorporated as a federal subject. It is located on the Neva River at the head of the Gulf of Finland on the Baltic Sea. In 1914 the name of the city was changed from St. Petersburg to Petrograd, in 1924 to Leningrad, and in 1991, back to St. Petersburg. In Russian literature, informal documents, and discourse, the word «saint» is usually omitted, leaving «Petersburg». In casual conversation Russians may drop the «berg» as well, referring to it as «Peter». St. Petersburg was founded by Tsar Peter the Great on May 27, OS. 1703. Between 1713 to 1728 and 1732 to 1918, St. Petersburg was the imperial capital of Russia. In 1918, the central government bodies moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow. It is Russia's second largest city after Moscow with 5 million inhabitants and the fourth most populated federal subject. St. Petersburg is a major European cultural center, and also an important Russian port on the Baltic Sea. St. Petersburg is often described as the most westernized city of Russia, as well as its cultural capital. It is the northernmost city in the world with a population of over 1 million. The historic center of St. Petersburg and related groups of monuments constitute a UNESCO World Heritage Site. St. Petersburg is also home to the Hermitage, one of the largest art museums in the world. A large number of foreign consulates, international corporations, banks, and other businesses are located in St. Petersburg. History. Before 1900 Swedish colonists built Nyenskans, a fortress, at the mouth of the Neva River in 1611, in a land then called Ingermanland, that was inhabited by Finnic tribe of Ingrans. A small town called Nyen grew up around it. Peter the Great was interested in seafaring and maritime affairs, and he intended to have Russia gain a seaport in order to be able to trade with other maritime nations. He needed a better seaport than Archangelsk, which was on the White Sea to the north and closed to shipping for months during the winter. On May 12, OS. 1703, during the Great Northern War, Peter the Great captured Nyenskans, and soon replaced the fortress. On May 27, OS. 1703, closer to the estuary 5 kilometers inland from the Gulf, on Zyachi Island, he laid down the Peter and Paul Fortress, which became the first brick and stone building of the new city. The city was built by conscripted peasants from all over Russia. A number of Swedish prisoners of war were also involved in some years under the supervision of Alexander Menshikov. Tens of thousands of serfs died building the city. Later, the city became the center of the St. Petersburg Governorate. Peter moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg in 1712. 9 years before the Treaty of Nystad of 1721 ended the war, he referred to St. Petersburg as the capital as early as 1704. During its first few years, the city developed around Trinity Square on the right bank of the Neva, near the Peter and Paul Fortress. However, St. Petersburg soon started to be built out according to a plan. By 1716 Domenico Trazzini had elaborated a project whereby the city centre would be located on Vasilievsky Island and shaped by a rectangular grid of canals. The project was not completed, and is evident in the layout of the streets. In 1716, Peter the Great appointed Jean-Baptiste Alexandre Leblond as the chief architect of St. Petersburg. The style of Petrine Baroque, developed by Trazzini and other architects and exemplified by such buildings as the Menshikov Palace, Kunstkamera, Peter and Paul Cathedral, 12 Collegia, became prominent in the city architecture of the early 18th century. In 1724 the Academy of Sciences, University and Academic Gymnasium were established in St. Petersburg by Peter the Great. In 1725, Peter died at the age of 52. His endeavors to modernize Russia had met with opposition from the Russian nobility, resulting in several attempts on his life and a treason case involving his son. In 1728, Peter II of Russia moved his seat back to Moscow. But 4 years later, in 1732, under Empress Anna of Russia, St. Petersburg was again designated as the capital of the Russian Empire. It remained the seat of the Romanov dynasty and the imperial court of the Russian Tsars, as well as the seat of the Russian government, for another 186 years until the Communist Revolution of 1917. In 1736 to 1737 the city suffered from catastrophic fires. To rebuild the damaged boroughs, a committee under Burkhard Christoph von Munich commissioned a new plan in 1737. The city was divided into 5 boroughs, and the city centre was moved to the Admiralty Borough, situated on the east bank between the Neva and Fontanka. It developed along 3 radial streets, which meet at the Admiralty Building on a now one street known as Nevsky Prospect, Gorokovaya Street and Vaznerinsky Prospect. Baroque architecture became dominant in the city during the first 60 years, culminating in the Elizabethan Baroque, represented most notably by Bartolomeo Rastrelli, with such buildings as the Winter Palace. In the 1760s, Baroque architecture was succeeded by neoclassical architecture, established in 1762. The Commission of Stone Buildings of Moscow and St. Petersburg ruled that no structure in the city can be higher than the Winter Palace and prohibited spacing between buildings. During the reign of Catherine the Great in the 1760s-1780s, the banks of the Neva were lined with granite embankments. However, it was not until 1850 that the first permanent bridge across the Neva, Blagoveshchensky Bridge, was allowed to open. Before that, only pontoon bridges were allowed. Obvodny Canal became the southern limit of the city. The most prominent neoclassical and empire-style architects in St. Petersburg included Jean-Baptiste Valin de la Motte, Antonio Rinaldi, Yuri Felton, Giacomo Quarenghi, Andrei Voronikhin, Andrean Zakharov, Jean-François Thomas de Thoman, Carlo Rossi, Vasily Stasov, Auguste de Montferrand. In 1810, Alexander I established the first engineering higher learning institution, the St. Petersburg Main Military Engineering School in St. Petersburg. Many monuments commemorate the Russian victory over Napoleonic France in the Patriotic War of 1812, including the Alexander Column by Montferrand, erected in 1834, and the Nalva Triumphal Gate. In 1825, the suppressed Decembrist revolt against Nicholas I took place on the Senate Square in the city, a day after Nicholas assumed the throne. By the 1840s, neoclassical architecture had given way to various Romanticist styles, which dominated until the 1890s, represented by such architects as Andrei Stackenschneider and Konstantin Thon. With the emancipation of the peasants undertaken by Alexander II in 1861 and an industrial revolution, the influx of former peasants into the capital increased greatly. Poor boroughs spontaneously emerged on the outskirts of the city. St. Petersburg surpassed Moscow in population and industrial growth. It developed as one of the largest industrial cities in Europe, with a major naval base, river and seaport. The names of Saints Peter and Paul, bestowed upon original city's citadel and its cathedral, coincidentally were the names of the first 2 assassinated Russian emperors, Peter III and Paul I. The third emperor's assassination took place in Petersburg in 1881, when Alexander II fell victim to Narodniki. 1900 to present. The Revolution of 1905 began in St. Petersburg and spread rapidly into the provinces. On September 1, 1914, after the outbreak of World War I, the imperial government renamed the city Petrograd, meaning Peter's city, to remove the German word Sanctenburg. In March 1917, during the February Revolution, Nicholas II abdicated both for himself and on behalf of his son. ending the Russian monarchy and over 300 years of Romanov dynastic rule. On November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, stormed the Winter Palace in an event known thereafter as the October Revolution, which led to the end of the post-Tsarist provisional government, the transfer of all political power to the Soviets, and the rise of the Communist Party. After that, the city acquired a new descriptive name of the City of Three Revolutions, referring to the three major developments in the political history of Russia of the early 20th century. In September and October 1917, German troops invaded the West Estonian archipelago and threatened Petrograd with bombardment and invasion. On March 12, 1918, the Soviets transferred the government to Moscow, to keep it away from the state border. During the ensuing civil war, in 1919, General Yudenich, advancing from Estonia, repeated the attempt to capture the city, but Leon Trotsky mobilized the army and forced him to retreat. On January 26, 1924, 5 days after Lenin's death, Petrograd was renamed Leningrad. Later, some streets and other toponyms were renamed accordingly. The city has over 230 places associated with the life and activities of Lenin. Some of them were turned into museums, including the cruiser Aurora, a symbol of the October Revolution and the oldest ship in the Russian Navy. In the 1920s and 1930s, the poor outskirts were reconstructed into regularly planned boroughs. Constructivist architecture flourished around that time. Housing became a government-provided amenity. Many bourgeois apartments were so large that numerous families were assigned to what were called communal apartments. By the 1930s, 68% of the population lived in such housing. In 1935, a new general plan was outlined, whereby the city should expand to the south. Constructivism was rejected in favor of a more pompous Stalinist architecture, moving the city center further from the border with Finland. Stalin adopted a plan to build a new city hall with a huge adjacent square at the southern end of Mostofsky Prospect, designated as the new Main Street of Leningrad. After the Second World War, the Soviet-Finnish border moved northwards. Nevsky Prospect with Palace Square maintained the functions and the role of a city center. In December 1931, Leningrad was administratively separated from Leningrad Oblast. At that time it included the Leningrad suburban district, some parts of which were transferred back to Leningrad Oblast in 1936 and turned into Vsevolozhsky district, Krasnoselsky district, Pargolovsky district and Slutsky district. On December 1, 1934, Sergei Kirov, the popular communist leader of Leningrad, was assassinated, which became the pretext for the Great Purge. During World War II, German forces besieged Leningrad following the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The siege lasted 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944. The siege of Leningrad proved one of the longest, most destructive, and most lethal sieges of a major city in modern history. It isolated the city from most supplies except those provided through the Road of Life across Lake Ladoga. More than 1 million civilians died, mainly from starvation. Many others were eventually evacuated or escaped, so the city became largely depopulated. On May 1, 1945, Joseph Stalin, in his Supreme Commander Order No. 20, named Leningrad, alongside Stalingrad, Sevastopol, and Odessa, hero cities of the war. A law acknowledging the honorary title of Hero City passed on May 8, 1965, during the Brezhnev era. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR awarded Leningrad as a hero city the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star Medal for the heroic resistance of the city and tenacity of the survivors of the siege. The Hero City obelisk bearing the gold star sign was installed in April 1985. In October 1946, some territories along the northern coast of the Gulf of Finland, which had passed to the USSR from Finland in 1940 under the peace treaty following the Winter War, were transferred from Leningrad Oblast to Leningrad and divided into Sestroretsky District and Kurultny District. These included the town of Terazhoki. Leningrad and many of its suburbs were rebuilt over the post-war decades, partially according to pre-war plans. The 1948 General Plan for Leningrad featured radial urban development in the north as well as in the south. In 1953, Pavlovsky District in Leningrad Oblast was abolished, and parts of its territory, including Pavlovsk, merged with Leningrad. In 1954, the settlements Levashovo, Pargolovo and Pesostny merged with Leningrad. Leningrad gave its name to the Leningrad Affair, a notable event in the post-war political struggle in the USSR. It was a product of rivalry between Stalin's potential successors, where one side was represented by the leaders of the City Communist Party organization, the second most significant one in the country after Moscow. The entire elite leadership of Leningrad was destroyed, including the former mayor Kuznetsov, the acting mayor Pyotr Sergeyevich Popov, and all their deputies. Overall, 23 leaders were sentenced to the death penalty, 181 to prison or exile. About 2,000 ranking officials across the USSR were expelled from the party and the Komsomol and removed from leadership positions. The Leningrad Metro underground rapid transit system, designed before the war, opened in 1955 with its first 8 stations decorated with marble and bronze. However, after the death of Stalin in 1953, the perceived ornamental excesses of the Stalinist architecture were abandoned. From the 1960s to the 1980s, many new residential boroughs were built on the outskirts, while the functionalist apartment blocks were nearly identical to each other. Many families moved there from communarkas in the city center in order to live in separate apartments. On June 12, 1991, simultaneously with the first Russian presidential elections, the city authorities arranged for the mayoral elections and a referendum upon the name of the city. The turnout was 65%. 66.13% of the total count of votes went to Anatoly Sobchak, who became the first directly elected mayor of the city. Meanwhile, economic conditions started to deteriorate as the country tried to adapt to major changes. For the first time since the 1940s, food rationing was introduced, and the city received humanitarian food aid from abroad. This dramatic time was depicted in photographic series of Russian photographer Alexei Titarenko. In 1995, a northern section of the Kirovsko-Vyborgskaya line of the St. Petersburg metro was cut off by underground flooding, creating a major obstacle to the city development for almost 10 years. In 1996, Vladimir Yakovlev defeated Anatoly Sobchak in the elections for the head of the city administration. The title of the city head was changed from mayor to governor. In 2000, Yakovlev won re-election. His second term expired in 2004. The long-awaited restoration of broken subway connection was expected to finish by that time. But in 2003, Yakovlev suddenly resigned, leaving the governor's office to Valentina Matviyenko. The law on election of the city governor was changed, breaking the tradition of democratic election by a universal suffrage. In 2006, the city legislature reapproved Matviyenko as governor. Residential building had intensified again. Real estate prices inflated greatly, which caused many new problems for the preservation of the historical part of the city. Although the central part of the city has a UNESCO designation, the preservation of its historical and architectural environment became controversial. After 2005, the demolition of older buildings in the historical center was permitted. In 2006, Gazprom announced an ambitious project to erect a 396-meter skyscraper opposite to Smolny, which could result in the loss of the unique line of Petersburg landscape. Urgent protests by citizens and prominent public figures of Russia against this project were not considered by Governor Valentina Matviyenko and the city authorities until December 2010, when, after the statement of President Dmitry Medvedev, the city decided to find a more appropriate location for this project.